flew 25 missions as a top turret gunner on a B-24 in the Second World War. I was stationed with the 15th Air Force, which originally landed in North Africa in the beginning, and then moved into Italy as the Germans got pushed up further into Italy. And in Europe, really in the Second World War, there were 3 bombers, what we call heavy bombers. There were light bombers, but the heavy bombers, there was the B-17, the B-24, and then later in the war came the B-29, only because we didn't know we were going to be fighting the Japanese at that time, so we needed a plane that could cover greater distances. But in the European theater, there were just 2 heavy bombers, and that was the B-24 and the B-17. The reason the B-24 was concepted was because they needed a plane that would go a little further, distance-wise, would go maybe a little faster and carry a slightly bigger bomb load. So that's why a 24 came along. So in the South Pacific, there were probably more B-24s than B-17s. In Italy, the 15th Air Force is made up of 21 bomb groups. Each bomb group is a 28 plane, has 28 planes in it. And they're made up of 4 squadrons of 7 planes each. So, and usually you'll never find an airfield with more than 1 bomb group. The reason is it would take so long for them to take off in the morning for a mission that you could spend almost an hour rendezvousing, waiting for the other guys. And when you're using 200 gallons of fuel an hour, you don't want to let that go on too long, or you're going to cut your mission short, you know. So that's the reason. The 8th Air Force had 40 bomb groups, so they had almost twice as many as the 15. Out of those bomb groups, 19 of them were B-17s and 21 bomb groups of B-24s. But a lot of people wonder, as they say, there was, when you think about that many bomb groups, that meant that you could put over, in the air on any given day, you could put over 1,700 aircraft, heavy bombers in the air at the same time attacking Germany. And to think of it from a numbers, these things use 200 gallons an hour to fly. So just in 1 hour, if you had every bomb group flying, the heavies, you would be using over 300,000 gallons of gasoline an hour. So you can imagine the logistics of running a war. It is almost unbelievable how we could keep things going. But I like to call the B-24 or the B-17 here the grand old girl of the Second World War. As I said before, it's one of the few aircraft that continued on pretty much the way it was designed in 1935. It was built really around, in 1935, an aircraft, by the way, as you probably know, is built by how many engines it has and the horsepower. Because if the Army says, the Air Force says, we want a plane that'll carry an X amount of bombs, go a certain distance, fly at a certain altitude, make us one. Well, you'd have to say, what is the power of the engines? Because you're going to need to design the plane by the power of the engine. So when this was first built in 1935, the most powerful Pratt & Whitney was 750 horsepower. By the time the war came, these are 1,200 horsepower. But if you notice the thickness of the B-17 wings, they were designed for a lift. That dihedral in there, the airfoil, was built meant to get a lot of lift out of what horsepower they had. But that has drawbacks also. You can do that, but then you have problems like drag. The more air flows over something, the more drag it has. Even a rivet on a plane causes problems. But in those days, they didn't know how to put a plane together without Rosie the riveter putting rivets in to hold the metal together. And nowadays they can do it with welding, they can do it with even cements and so forth. So every little hole you see in an aircraft is going to be what they call drag. This aircraft happens to fly at a cruising speed of about 180 miles an hour, somewhere around there. It has a top speed of maybe 280 something, but usually you don't use the top speed except in when you need it. One of the problems of the Second World War, when the B-24s first went into service in England, they didn't show up very well. They had a lot of negative effects. They finally realized the reason was, one of the main reasons was, that they used to intermix B-24 bomb groups with B-17 bomb groups so they could all follow each other. That meant that the B-24 was going to have to fly a lot slower than it was designed for. The B-24 used to cruise at about 200 to 15, somewhere around there, and it would have to throttle back at 180. Now this makes a very deceptive problem for a pilot because it's hard to handle. It begins to get near stalling speeds. You have all kinds of headaches. Why they didn't think of that, I have no idea. It took them a few months, I guess, to figure that out. But they finally didn't. A B-17 and a B-24 carried a crew of 10 men. It was a pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, and 6 gunners. You had the top turret gunner, you had the ball turret gunner, 2 waist gunners, and now the one turret I wouldn't have liked was the ball turret. You couldn't really be much over a 5'6" to be a ball turret gunner because it's a fairly confined area in there. Yeah, the door's only about that big, and you slide in and kind of slide down the bottom, and then close the door. So if you had a tendency of claustrophobia, you wouldn't want to be a ball turret gunner. And then they would pump you down hydraulically, so you're below the plane then. And so if you wanted to get out in a hurry, there's no way you're ever going to do it. It used to get very, very cold on missions. It would be, you would dress just like this man here. It would take, well, let me give you an idea of what a mission would like. Nobody would know they were flying a mission until the evening before. Everybody would flock out to the bulletin board, and they would list who was flying the next day and what cruise. And then if your name was there, you made sure you got to bed fairly early because the wake-up call was 3 o'clock in the morning. And you would get up, have breakfast, get dressed, of course, and then the important part was briefing. And this is when you found out what your mission was going to be. So you'd go in this room, there'd be 288 guys there, so because you have 4 squadrons of 28 planes. And they would pull back the curtain, and there they would have the mission of the target, what to expect enemy aircraft-wise, what to expect anti-aircraft-wise, and all the things that you might want to know. that's when you would hear groaning. If it was a target everybody knew that was a bad one, you would hear the room would just be a groan because they knew somebody wasn't coming back. That was for sure. You always wanted what you call the milk run, which was a target, maybe like a railroad bridge someplace that didn't have much anti-aircraft fire, or the Germans didn't protect it too much. And then from briefing, you would go to what you call the equipment tent. And then you would get dressed, which would take about 25, 30 minutes to get dressed, because there's the first thing you put on under there, besides your regular clothes, is an electric flying suit, because the temperatures are going to get very cold. And then you put on the lambskin suit. And then on top of that, you put your harness on, or pick your Mae West on first. Harness goes on top of that, which is your parachute harness. And you pick out your parachute, and that take with you. And that would all take, and then it got pretty bulky. You got those big shoes. So when you got in one of these aircraft, there was not much space in here, because the bomb bay is full of, at that time was full of bombs. So you had to kind of creep around. It wasn't an easy thing. That's why most people were young, I guess. But now the temperatures normally would be at 40 to 50 below zero. And you would be at that temperature for maybe, it depends on the mission, but you could be 4.5, 5 hours, or maybe less, a little less, in that area anyway. And then you're on oxygen, you're on the electric flying suit, and the electric flying suit would plug in wherever you were positioned. So it would run off the electric circuit in the aircraft. And without the electric flying suit, it would be pretty tough. Would get extremely cold, you know. And then during the flight, when you're up at altitude in those temperatures, the pilot would always check around the whole plane about every 10 minutes, maybe a little less. And everybody would check in. You'd say, ball turret, top turret fine, you know, boom, 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 to make sure everybody wasn't lacking oxygen or something. You know. It's kind of a check. As a gunner, you had that, in training, you had to take those apart blindfolded. They would give you 2.5 minutes to take it apart and put it back together again blindfolded. Why they ever did this, I could never understand, because there's no way in the world at 50 below zero you're going to be able to work on a gun. But that's the way the Army Air Corps, and the Army, that's how it works. Repetition. Continually do the same thing over so that you don't have to think about it when an emergency comes.
How many bombs did it hold?
The B-17 would carry, it depends, your bomb load would depend on the length of the mission. Because you're going to be using more gas and so forth, so you had to kind of regulate these things, and what the poundage is, whether you're going with 1,000-pound bombs or fragmentations. We used to fly some missions with what we call fragmentation bombs. When we used to support, for instance, when the Germans were being pushed up through the Po Valley, we were asked to do low level, 250 feet we would bomb at with fragmentation bombs, and these are little 50-pound fragmentation bombs. And they would use smoke bomb, what they call smoke bombs, on the ground to point out which side the Germans were on and which side we were on. So when you came in at 250 feet, you knew which side you're on and which side of the line you're on. there was one instance at one time where, unfortunately, the wind changed and the smoke went the wrong way, and we killed something like over 200 British soldiers, unfortunately. But those are accidents that happen in wartime, and there's nothing you can do about it. A bomb load of a big 24 would usually, or a 17 would usually be somewhere around 5,000 to 4,500 pounds. It's hard to believe nowadays some of the aircraft, single-engine aircraft, can carry a bigger bomb load than the heavy bombers in the Second World War. And that's dependent again on because of the size of the engines, the horsepower. All your modern planes, if you notice, some of them, the wings are, you can hardly see the wings, they're so small, because they don't need that kind of lift with the power. So things have changed quite a bit aviation-wise. In the 30s, actually, some planes had to be what they called, like in the Second World, or the First World War, were biplanes. You needed two wings to get enough lift to get those things off the ground. So that's a progress, I guess you might call that progress.
What was the average age of the crew?
Our particular crew, to me it seemed like a very young man's war because everybody seemed to be young. My crew averaged, I think we're about 18 years old. I happened to join when I was 17. You could join with your parents' permission. And everybody on our crew was 18 except the pilot. We used to call him Dad. And he was 22 years old. I think he had gray hair even, you know, the guy was really old. But everybody seemed young, you know, I don't know why. Maybe it was, maybe they were young, I don't know. The Second World War was a different kind of an atmosphere in the country. Everybody had one intent. We were, if you remember, we were just, when the war started, we were really just coming out of a depression. Women didn't work in factories, and without the women in the Second World War going to work to build this stuff, we'd have never won the war, to be honest with you. What won that war for us was production. The ability to produce, outproduce the Germans and the Japanese. And we could do it by everybody going to work. And that's when women started doing that, because in those days, the woman, you never left the home. That was always stayed home with the kids. That's the way it was, because there weren't enough jobs for two people in the family to work. There were limited jobs. And we came very close, as you probably know, to losing that war in the beginning. I'll give you, for instance, in 1942 and the beginning of 43, we were thinking of stopping daylight bombing because we were losing so many planes and so many crews we couldn't replace them. The English had quit daylight bombing. They found it impossible to do, and they switched to nighttime bombing, which is absolutely doesn't cause too much problem. It doesn't hurt the enemy as much because you can't bomb factories. What we needed to do to beat the Germans was to be able to bomb their factories so they couldn't produce aircraft anymore or anything for war. And we were losing that battle because the Germans had complete control of the air in Germany, over Germany. And that's how they, if an average crew in those days asked how long they would be in missions, once to finish 25 missions, you would have to almost tell them, son, you're not going to make it. You're going to die here. Because the average length was 6 to 12 missions, was the average length of career in those early days of 82. What began to swing the war was, as I said, was production, but then the P-51 bomber, or fighter came along. And now we had an aircraft that could give us cover, because bombers could, the fighters we had could not give us air cover going deep into Germany where the factories were. But the P-51 could, and starting, they said the war really swung in our direction. In the month of February of 1944, that seemed to be when the war changed. The 8th Air Force and the 15th concentrated night after night, or day after day, on German aircraft factories. And the losses were heavy, but it was worth it in the long run. I never wanted to talk about the Second World War. I don't think my kids ever knew I was in the Army till they were in their 30s. It was something in the past that happened in the past, something you didn't want to remember really. Because you had to go, you got out, you got an education, you raised a family, you got married, you bought a home, you got to start paying for it. You had a different life. I didn't go to my first reunion of my bomb group until I was 85 years old.
Wow.
Because I didn't even keep in touch with our group, but nobody did. It was something in the past. But then I began to think, let's keep the memories alive of those guys that never came back. I don't do it for anybody, any thanks. I just want people to remember the way we're rewriting history books in 100 years. World War II might not even be in the history books. It might be somebody you call a figment of your imagination. I don't know.
We appreciate your service and your candor. This is so insightful to hear your recollections. I really thank you for this.
Again, I don't do it for gratitude.